American Dream here at the University of Rhode Island. My name is Kate Brewster. I'm first and foremost an alum, which I think they only invite alum to introduce people. And I am the Executive Director of the Johnny Cake Center of Peacedale, a local social service organization that provides food, clothing, and other basic needs to your neighbors here in South Kingstown and Narragansett. South County, I think, is known as a vacation destination with beachfront homes and world-class restaurants and a beloved fishing community. But many of the jobs that make this a special place to live and visit simply don't pay wages that can support a family. We also know that many seniors and people with disabilities living in our community have a difficult time keeping up with the high cost of living in the area. As director of the Johnny Cake Center and a member of the board of the directors of our local homeless shelter, the Welcome House, I can tell you that both poverty and homelessness are significant problems just outside the walls of this university. The Johnny Cake Center provides food to approximately 650 people every month. And just last year, we distributed more than 215,000 pounds of food to over 1,800 individuals who came to us for help. The Welcome House, our local shelter, provided shelter and temporary and permanent housing to more than 170 adults and children, and provided 5,200 free lunches to their guests and local residents. And for those of you who are interested in helping tackle poverty and homelessness here in our community, call me, text, tweet, Facebook. There's plenty of ways to get in touch with me, and we would love to put you all to work. It is my pleasure to introduce tonight two individuals who are extremely knowledgeable about the issues of poverty and homelessness. Tonight's speakers bring a national perspective to a serious local problem. Please join me in giving a round of applause to Dr. Deanna Trella and Dr. Timothy Hilton. Dr. Trella is an associate professor and director of children's studies at Eastern Washington University. Her primary area of research concerns family and child homelessness. She is dedicated to using her expertise as an applied researcher to improve the welfare of homeless families and children in an effort to strengthen economic, social, and educational outcomes in Eastern Washington. Dr. Trella provides program evaluation and analysis for the Spokane Public School System, the Inland Northwest Community Foundation, and the City of Spokane. Dr. Timothy Hilton is an associate professor in the School of Social Work at Eastern Washington University as well. Prior to his academic career, he worked as a social worker and a policy analyst, primarily in the areas of homelessness, poverty alleviation, and employment services. Before joining Eastern Washington University in 2013, he was director of social work at Northern Michigan University, where he began his research on homelessness. He continues to research homelessness and poverty in Eastern Washington and has worked with several community organizations to create services based on current research and evidence-based practice models. Tim currently teaches several social work courses, both at the bachelor and master's levels, including social welfare policy, community and organizational practice, and research. He is co-author of a research methods textbook and has published several academic articles based on his research. Please give a warm East Coast welcome to our West Coast speakers, Dr. Deanna Trella and Dr. Timothy Hilton. Thank you both for being here this evening.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Well, we might be West Coast speakers, but we're both originally from the East Coast. I'm from New York, and he's from Massachusetts, so we're happy to be home. We're happy to be on the right side of the country. So thank you so much for having us. We're really pleased to be with you all tonight, and hope to share a bit about our research and what we've done first in northern Michigan and the Upper Peninsula, and now in eastern Washington. I will be kind of manning the podium up here, and just to let you know, we do have some audio clips from research that we've done throughout the presentation. So I'll try to preface them with a little bit of information about the people who you'll be hearing from, but oftentimes we find that the audio speaks for itself.
So one of the things, can you all hear me? One of the things that I would use to say to describe our research is that We look at poverty, which is a structural issue, and you hear lots of data about poverty, but part of what we try to do is provide sort of a looks like to understand sort of the felt experience of what it's like to live in deep poverty, and to reveal a lot about poverty that seems to be left out of the data. We do a lot of work doing firsthand accounts, a lot of in-depth interviewing with very marginalized populations. We've looked at issues of rural homelessness, homeless families, including families with children in public schools who are homeless and oftentimes doubled up with extended family and friends. We've looked at impoverished rural youth and their transition from high school to the real world, and looking at some of the troubles they've had. I've done some work looking at ex-offenders and their transitions back to their communities. Basic idea is that this qualitative approach, what we say that this in-depth interviews, these first-hand accounts, help provide some insight about these very understudied and undercounted groups. And the goal is really to understand poverty from the inside out, to be able to give some advice to policymakers and service providers to help them better serve these groups.
So in addition to going through the research that we've completed, at the end we'll sort of bring it all together, because it does seem like two disparate areas of the country that we've studied, northern Michigan and eastern Washington, but there's some really interesting commonalities that persist across rural areas in particular that I think we'll be able to touch on toward the end. Yeah.
So just to give a broad overview of some research, like I mentioned, we studied homelessness in the UP. First article I wrote was called Homeless in God's Country, and it was looking at a very extremely rural place, and just a really undercounted, sometimes invisible homeless group. Then we also did some work looking at families, both homeless families, and then also looking at how family is used by those who are homeless. So the relationships that the homeless have with their extended family. Another thing I'll talk briefly about is research I've done on some of the reservations in Michigan, looking at the transition from prison and jails back to life on reservations.
And since moving to Washington, we've had the opportunity to get involved with some community organizations in the city of Spokane, and specifically the Spokane Public School System, and also a program known as HEART, the Spokane Public School System's homeless education research team. And we've been able to address some of the concerns among poor families with children, some of whom who are actively homeless in the region, and look at some unique challenges that they face in meeting their child's educational needs and requirements while living in a really precarious situation.
I'm going to talk just briefly about sort of my first work in the area of homeless research. In a very rural area of Michigan, in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan along Lake Superior. If anybody's ever been there, they know it's...
Any Yoopers out there by chance? No? Anyone familiar with the region?
Okay. It's a great place, eh?
There you go, eh?
Yeah. Extremely cold, very harsh winters. Mm-hmm. And during the course of the time that the two of us were living there, we were able to interview about 130 people who had been homeless, chronically homeless, both individuals and families. And really the first step in that research was just to get a sense of how these folks survive. And these are places in very small towns with not well-developed shelter systems, and in oftentimes places where a human service agency anywhere nearby. And one of the things that we began to see as we talked with these folks and sat with them for long periods of time is that some of them did really good job getting by, being able to get enough food, being able to stay warm, being able to maintain some social networks, while other people struggled mightily to live. And we began to say, well, what makes the difference? What makes some of these people allow to cope better and others to suffer so much? And one of the things we saw is some of the factors that we saw as being really important. One was the size of the city. Even in very small, even in rural areas, there were bigger towns and smaller towns. People in smaller towns have much more difficulty than people in bigger towns. One of the things that makes homelessness so difficult living in an extremely rural place is that things are spaced apart, and you have to walk sometimes very long times. We saw that family and friendship networks were incredibly important. How did people survive when homeless? Well, they relied on family and friends. And this seems like a pretty straightforward finding, but this kind of flies in the face of what many people say when they talk about homelessness. People say, we're homeless, and homelessness is the result of having exhausted all of your family and friends, and that's how people live on the streets. And what we found is it's not exactly that simple. In fact, very often it's your family and friends that allow you to survive when homeless. Right? Although they're not taking you in, they may take you in very difficult times. In the coldest times, they may provide storage, a place to store your things. They may provide food. They may do any number of things, even if they're not willing to or able to house you. We found that geography was really important. The spatial layout of a town, for example, makes a big difference in terms of the ability to cope with homelessness. We talked with many people in towns that were very spatially large who had to walk sometimes several hours to move from one human service agency to another to get some basic resources. And in other places, things that were centrally located made it much easier. We also saw a lot of variation by season and time. It's a lot easier to be homeless in a place like the Upper Peninsula or even a place like Rhode Island in the summertime than it is the wintertime. So those are some of the interesting things that we found from that research. One of the things that sort of came out that I thought was really interesting was the way that people talked about their lives and their situations. One of the lines that Deanna and I will say a lot is that the biggest difference between the very poor and everybody else is money, right? And that in a very real way, these folks share the values and beliefs of the rest of society. When people talk about their responsibilities, people talk about they're very often talking about their situations in such a way to take personal responsibility for where they are. At the same time, they recognize that they're in a very precarious situation, that they're not getting the assistance that they need, and they're somewhat distraught. So we thought about this a lot, and about how people make sense of their own situations. And one of the things we said is they're saying all these things, right, about personal responsibility. They're saying lots of things about their situations in their lives that seem to reflect sort of the dominant of work ethic. And at the same time, they're also recognizing that there's these great injustices in the world. And we came up with this concept, calling it the homeless script. The basic idea that people will talk, right, and they'll say the things that seem to reflect what we would like them to say, while there's also this inherent sense of injustice.
Okay.
So we're going to play for you just a short clip from one of our interviews.
At any point did you think about, would it be easier on your own? Did you think about having Zoe stay with your family?
No.
No.
That's my little girl, and she is mine and my responsibility. So whatever I have to do to make everything okay is my job, not anybody else's. I made the mistake once with my son, and that is why I don't have him anymore. It's because I stepped out and asked for help and asked somebody else to take him, and it turned around and bit me. So
sorry, there's some of the fuzziness in there, and the baby sort of talking in the back. But the woman was saying, this is her situation. It's her responsibility. She's homeless with a child. She doesn't want to put this on anybody else. When she asked for help the last time, it resulted in losing her son to the foster care system. Right? So, and here is, simultaneously talking about, a reflection of the dominant police, but also recognizing, gosh, I need help here, and there doesn't seem to be this structure here for helping me in a real way.
So that research predated my arrival at Northern Michigan University. And when I came on board as a family child sociologist, really moved the research in a different direction in terms of thinking about families and how they cope with the homeless experience and how unique it is compared to individuals who often have different circumstances, different social networks that they can rely upon to help them. So this second work, again, based in the UP, they can only do so much. The use of family while coping gave us an opportunity to think about the decisions that families make compared to single individuals who are homeless and the different circumstances that they have to take into account when making decisions around how to seek help, when to call upon family and friends. And the big takeaway from this aspect of our work was this notion of rational decision-making. The context of homelessness is inherently irrational and chaotic in many ways. However, we tended to find the same pattern among all of the families we spoke with, all of the individuals we spoke with, that there was an inherent rationale behind driving a lot of the choices that they made. And so we came across, sort of ended up conceptualizing this in terms of thinking about high threshold versus low threshold, in terms of when do you seek help? What's that tipping point for you? And it really, with some variation, tended to fall along the lines of whether or not we are dealing with an individual versus a family. And so individuals oftentimes had a very high threshold for help seeking. They could rely on family, but only in extreme circumstances. They generally had to ask for very little help. They had larger social networks they could rely upon that were available to them, in part because they were one person. They could easily sleep on a couch. They could easily take a spare room or curl up on someone's floor. They didn't take up a lot of space. So seeking help for them often occurred in the most dire of circumstances, perhaps in the dead of winter when things were especially cold. But they oftentimes were able to make do on their own, living in some really interesting circumstances, we found. Someone living in a snow cave, others living in an actual rock cave. But they were able to make do because they were one person. Right? And we contrasted that with low threshold. And that tended to be our families who had to seek help faster. Because it wasn't just one individual. It was oftentimes at least one kid, 2 adults, in some cases, I think upwards of 3, 4 kids. And they require a lot more help. They take up more space. It's far more distracting and disturbing to a non-homeless family. I often talk to my students and I say, what would happen to you if you lost your housing today? And they immediately say, I go to mom and dad. So all of you mom and dads out there, just know your kids are gunning for you, right? They still think they've got a place at home. You're their plan A, friends are their plan B. Now imagine they were coming to your front door and they had boyfriend or girlfriend with them, husband and wife with them, and 3 kids. It's a lot harder to house those individuals, but their need is so much greater. And oftentimes we found that families are perhaps more willing to help when kids are involved, make you a bit more sympathetic when you have kids in tow and you got to turn away the kid versus, Jimmy No Good, who's been, taking up a lot of your resources over time and has really outstayed his welcome. It's harder to turn away those kids. And so their threshold for seeking help was far lower. They're more willing to step up and say, as much as it hurts us to have to admit, we need assistance. So we have a couple of quotes here. We weren't able to turn into audio clips, but I'll just read them for those of you who may not be able to see clearly. And this sort of is indicative of this notion of low versus high threshold. The first is a single gentleman who says, I was always amazed that I was able to do what I did for so long. and never become a burden or have a bad name. I always tried to keep a certain level of, because I never wanted to be a burden. I knew some people in a similar situation, some people who, when they came to the driveway, everyone would just say, shh, maybe he'll go away. I never wanted to be like that. I never tried to overstay my welcome or anything like that. So very mindful of the pressures that they're putting upon other people, friends, family members, to take them in. Versus a mother of one who says, it was me and my boyfriend, our son, his mom, and his sister. Just it was crowded in there, and he didn't like all the people there. And he's like, if it was just you and the baby, it would be a different story, but it's too many people. And he's like, you got to get out. And that's a hard decision for non-homeless family members to make. Right? That's your blood, that's your family. You want to believe that they'd be there to help you. But oftentimes those family members are themselves in financial straits and oftentimes don't have the room to house their homeless family members. So it's a difficult decision all around, and it creates a lot of tension among family members. Tongue-in-cheek described the audio that you'll hear in a moment as suburban living. Not because they were in the suburbs, but because they were literally living in a suburban. Was it a Chevy?
A Chevy Suburban.
Chevy Suburban. So I'll play this for you.
I've been roughing it here for about the last month. We've been with a couple of friends, family, and the point is you can't stick a family of four in the middle of most any household.
Right.
So we've been bouncing around here and there and slept in our truck a few nights.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Oh, I think that was the end of it. He had a very young child. I believe the one child was 2 years old, and they were living in the vehicle in very cold conditions. And if you caught him when he said it's very difficult to put a family of four in a household, right? So the big takeaway from that study was this idea that homeless individuals are very rational in the thought process that they go through in order to maintain their social circumstances, with social ties with family and with friends, to not overstay their welcome, to know how to navigate those relationships. I can ask Sarah for help. I haven't asked her in a long while. I'm able to sleep on her floor again. Or perhaps we can go to our cousin here and we haven't overstayed our welcome. We haven't burned any bridges. So always very mindful of maintaining those ties rather than overstaying welcomes or being a burden. Our next study, you've just got to do it because those are your kids, and all of our papers tend to begin with quotes from our participants. It's sort of a quirk of academia, I think, in writing these articles, but really centered around this idea of survival parenting. What it means to parent in really extreme circumstances. In some respects, getting to talk to these family members and understand what they do on a day-to-day basis was itself exhausting because they are walking the streets, going to various social services with their children in tow. And this notion of survival parenting evolved from that. And this really pertains to this idea of this combination of factors: near panic, with the seriousness of the circumstances parents find themselves in. Perhaps the most pressing requirement for a parent, responsibility for a parent, is to provide their child with basic needs. As a parent, you want nothing more than to keep your child safe, to keep them housed, fed, and for these for these individuals, these families, that itself. And so the sense of failure is readily apparent for them, and so they responded with this sense of hypervigilance, this idea that they would do anything and everything to meet their child's most basic needs, and it involved a lot of hustling and a lot of going to various agencies and making do in really difficult circumstances. Right? Kids in strollers. They didn't have a stable place to nap, to maintain a schedule. They didn't have ready access to refrigeration to provide their children nutritious food. And so it was a constant mindfulness about what they're doing to their kids and a sense of failure as parents. And they really funneled that energy into trying their darndest to find that night, the place that they were going to stay for the night. find the food for their child, ensure that their child is safe. And what really resonated from these interviews, and what goes back to this notion of the homeless script, was that these parents know what it means to be a good parent. They are no different than you or I. They know that their child needs to be on a schedule, that that child would thrive with educational activities and engagement and downtime. So they're no different than you and I in terms of their understanding of what it means to be a good parent. And perhaps that's even more disheartening for them because they can't achieve that given their circumstances. So I'll play you a few clips that children are often in the backgrounds of these interviews, yakking. This first one talks about the idea of being homeless with kids. Whoops.
People that probably say that it's easier to be homeless with kids are the ones that don't have kids, because a lot of times I notice that like DHS or the places are more willing to help people when you have kids. You know, when you're homeless and you have kids, than not. And I don't think that's right either. But I'm sure those people that are and had to, you know, drag a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old halfway across town in a stroller with, you know, 4 or 5 bags of clothes and diapers just to go ask someone for a motel room for the night, or back across town because you gotta go, they don't have funds and you gotta go ask them this other center, you know.
It's hard.
And your kids are sitting there whining and crying, you know.
No,
It's hot, I don't want to walk anymore.
Especially that age, yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that? Yeah. So really getting at that idea that it's far more difficult to be homeless when you've got 3 other kids to take care of, put their needs first. But for anyone who's ever had young kids, especially 3 and 5, like she describes here, it's a literal nightmare on a good day. And for these families, it's even more of a struggle because you're trying to meet their most basic needs here.
I'll just go to the third one.
And we'll skip through that long day walking one. You about a long day walking with kids in tow who are not very happy about it. It speaks to the idea of something else that arose from the interviews, which is really disheartening because, as this woman suggested, we're more likely to perhaps help families who have kids, right? They're more likely to get help first, but families are often very reluctant to utilize social services for fear that their children are taken away from them.
All this time since February, I've been telling my caseworker that this is my situation, you know. This place is booked up for the summer. We're going to be homeless, you know. I need... Well, when I finally had to come up here, and I spoke with her, and I went and I told her that every time I talk to you, you sound more desperate and desperate. And I said, well, I am. I am. I said, you know, school, we were talking another year's coming up. I've got to find a place because I have my son here. She said, stop. Do you know where you're at? She goes, because don't tell me you can't provide for him because Children's Services will get involved. If you can't provide for your son. So I just lost it. I ran over to Salvation Army and cried to them because I'm asking for help and they're going to say, well, if you can't take care of your kid, we'll take him.
So you can see the difficulty in reaching out for help, but then the fear that divulging your circumstance could mean getting into the web of social services and child protective services that might mean your child is taken away from you, which is itself another difficulty above and beyond the challenge of parenting while homeless.
Talk just real briefly about the research I had done on the reservations in Michigan. And really, I think this is a good example of what we call policy failure. Folks who had committed a crime on a reservation, typically or very often, because of our major crimes bill, are going to federal prisons. And because of that, they are thousands of miles often from their families and not having the support while they're in prison. And in addition, they're not eligible to receive services from state reentry programs. So that transition is even more difficult. In addition, people going back to reservations, which are largely contain HUD-funded housing, are not eligible to stay in HUD housing. So the ability to go home is really not there for a lot of these folks. This is sort of combined requirements to not fraternize with other ex-offenders, which make it very difficult for people to participate in cultural activities, which are very important to folks who are exiting prison, very often in the early stages of sobriety, and dealing with addictions and needing that family to help. And then so what you have is a situation where these families and these tribes who want to help their members being in this position where they want to help, but then they can't because of their relationship to the federal government. And so I talked with many people, and essentially what these folks were doing was going from house to house, hiding from their probation officers, being a place where they're not, and also hiding from the FBI, who would be looking to see. Really, you see this, I mean, these policies sort of come together in such a way that there is no opportunity for these folks to be able to rebuild a life. And here's a quick quote. Ever since treatment and everything else, it's been so hard. It's been emotionally draining. Being locked up is easier than this. Just to get back to nothing, which is where I am right now, basically homeless. It's a lot for me to handle. I'm grateful for my sobriety, but I'm not even able to get on my reservation. I can't even get counseling and for my depression from my tribe. So you think, you know, we send people out of prison. We want them to rebuild a life, but we create policy that's so restrictive that it's impossible. I'm talking just real briefly about some of the Deanna on amongst children in our local schools in Spokane, Washington. Work in schools may have heard of something called the McKinney-Vento Act, which requires school systems to provide some help to children who become homeless, and at the very least to allow those students to continue to attend their school of origin if they have to move in with grandma or grandpa or some transportation assistance to these kids. Well, one of the things the city of Spokane found is that these kids, and there's many of them, and actually in Spokane County it was almost 5% of the kids who are in that school system, that they often had much lower graduation rates, that they had more likely to have mental health problems and social adjustment issues. So one of the things we did is we went around and talked to some of these kids and some data, some of their educational outcomes. And one of the things we sort of learned is that for many of these kids and their families, they're not eligible for help. The reason they're not eligible for help is that we don't consider them homeless until they're living in a car or living on the streets. So when you're evicted from your home, foreclosed on your home, and you move in with grandma or grandpa or an aunt or uncle, it's a very difficult situation. It creates a lot of stress, creates a lot of need, but those families are not yet eligible for housing assistance because they're not technically homeless. The other thing we looked at was how does the situation of being homeless come to do things like cause social anxiety, cause depression for these kids, or how does it ultimately lead to poor grades? And just play some clips, and because I think it's almost easier.
Yeah, it was a little cold. Yeah, then it started getting hot.
How did that work out? What was that time like?
It was rough. I have a disability, so it was hard on my disability.
trying to keep it a secret, try to keep it easy for my son to understand. Keep it from him, keeping to understand what's going on, and hearing from him, why can't we just go home? A situation where we really don't have a home. The car is the home for right now, and so Mommy can get a place for us to live. So it was definitely challenging.
And that was February and March into April of this year.
Yes.
And so was your son already in school?
Yes, he was in school. I was at that time driving him back and forth because I really didn't want anyone to know what was going on. I fought very hard to keep that a big secret. A lot of people you see that live in their cars had a lot of stuff in their cars and bags or clothes or stuff, but I kept stuff in the trunk of my car and I kept stuff in the storage. I kept it a big secret. I did not want anyone to know.
Now, why a secret? I mean, obviously, if people know, you might go home.
Well, it's embarrassing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very embarrassing. But I finally broke down and said something to his counselor at school. Found out. I talked to her first, and she said, well, this is what I can help you do, and she helped me with that and referred me to the Salvation Army. And then my other concern was, well, I don't want to take him out of school because my son does have an IEP. And she said, we can help you with that too.
Yeah. That situation, IEP is an individual education plan. This son had learning disabilities, and for months she's living in her car, homeless, not telling anybody because she's scared of the reaction at school. Ultimately, when the school finds out, they refer her to the Salvation Army. She gets a housing voucher, and they help her with her son's disability. So you think that fear, right? This fear of services is real. It has real implications, but sometimes that fear is based on incorrect information. Let's skip it.
Okay.
Yeah. Talk real briefly. I mentioned before we were interested in youth from high school in these very rural areas, oftentimes who were very poor. And we were interested in talking to the youth and learning something about where they live, why they choose to stay there, what their plans are, and that sort of thing. And basic question is, why do youth stay in these very rural, remote places with few job opportunities and failing industries? And one of the things we saw, and I'll summarize, was that they very much idealized small town life. They knew how to survive in these small communities. And while they weren't going to thrive, they weren't necessarily going to have stable employment, they at least had people that they could rely on. And especially because there was this fear of places that they had, they decided that they were going to stay. So I'm going to jump down real quick to this one here.
Just click it.
Well, I think for business, if I went for going for business, I think it would be a good area. I wouldn't make it like a bunch of money like if I did living in a big city, but I would gain so much more from it than just money. Mm-hmm. I would gain the employees and, like I said, family. Mm-hmm. And then once you're in a town and you establish yourself, that in Colville, like it's so small, that everybody will know you and everybody will have respect for you and your business and support, and yeah, and I have family here too. And I love how you can go camping and you can, if you need to get away from everything, you can get away from everything. You're not stuck in a big everybody. Mm-hmm. You can walk around in the store here and you know people mm-hmm. and say hi to them, Mm-hmm. It's a better connection.
Okay. So, sorry, some of the audio you maybe couldn't hear, but she was saying it's, she has this sense that this is better connection. She knows people. It's a real idyllic life. On the other hand, this woman, it's sort of interesting. She was working in a jobs program. She was working in a thrift store, and the program had ended. She didn't have any money. She was about to be evicted from her home. She had young children. And just looking around, there really wasn't this opportunity. But it was the continuously looking within the town ability to think about outside, because as dire as it is here, they don't know how to survive. A, and B, I got the sense that there was this fear of the unknown, the fear of someplace else, someplace bigger could be actually worse.
So how can we to the theme of the colloquium and this notion of poverty and inequality? And I think it really comes down to this idea that while poverty is a structural concept, something that we can think about in very concrete terms, it's also a lived experience. And individuals, depending on their circumstances, be they with children or not, be they in rural areas or in more urban areas, are going to experience homelessness differently. And some of that might have to do with, as we mentioned at the beginning, geography, location, issues around family networks, access to those resources. And the rural homelessness is just qualitatively different than homelessness that we might typically think of in an urban area. We see it more readily in urban areas, perhaps, and it's less visible in rural areas. And there are certain circumstances that we have to take into account in thinking about that. The micro contexts related to these families are often something that we need to take into account, how poverty impacts them in terms of their social networks, their ability to engage in normal circumstances, their emotional health, their physical functioning. All of these issues have to be taken into account. It's not simply the notion of providing housing for homeless individuals, but they oftentimes have mental health issues that need to be addressed. They have children with special needs that need to be addressed. They themselves may be suffering from some kind of substance abuse. It's a very complex, multifaceted issue that requires a lot of different avenues of engagement.
So one of the things to think about that, I mean, you could imagine suddenly lose their job and have no income, and they could perhaps both lose their apartment. One moves in with a family member, there's plenty of room and enough income to get folks by. The other, has a family who are already helping other siblings and can't take somebody in, or doesn't have the resources, right, to help, and maybe in a situation where there's strained relationships because of history. I mean, from a data standpoint, they both show up as unemployed, no income, recently evicted, right? But the actual impact, how does that come to shape that person's life or their family's life, is going to be dramatically different. And part of what we hope to point to is that real minutia is important to pay attention to if we're going to think about what's the impact of poverty on somebody's life chances.
Well, not just what's the impact, what's the lived experience in the moment, but also how do we prevent individuals from experiencing this? What are some issues that we can look to that might indicate that somebody is at risk of doubling up with family members? How do we get at them 2 steps, 3 steps before they end up on the door of the shelter or seeking help from family members? How can we stabilize them? And one of the themes that arose from this is, we oftentimes just sort of talk about the experience of interviewing these individuals, and inevitably these sort of themes arise. And one of them is I think, helpful for those who are visual learners in thinking about the homeless experience. It's very much like trying to climb a sandhill. Right? 1 step forward, 2 steps back, and the ground beneath you never feels entirely stable. So while you might receive housing, it may only be temporary. While you might receive help from family members, you can't rely on it for very long. So we're never entirely stable and able to get a foothold and able to get a leg up.
It's real quick. So what from a program, services, or policy perspective? One of the obvious points is that programs and services have to understand context, including these micro contexts. When you're working with somebody who's homeless, you have to sort of understand that that person comes from a family, that person comes from a community, that person comes from some circle of friends. And we have to not assume that this means that they've exhausted all of those networks and that it's just an
might look like is actually helping those who help the homeless, helping those family members so they can support their homeless relative, helping them with food assistance, with housing assistance, perhaps utility payments, food stamps, to help those family members who are homeless or individuals who are homeless who oftentimes have nothing to bargain with other than perhaps their time, help cleaning the house, something like that. So what can we do to help those who are perhaps the first avenue of help and hope for those families?
Yeah, very often one of the most successful anti-homelessness policies out there is food stamps, or now called SNAP. I'm like, well, that doesn't really make sense, but it's the idea that if an individual is getting $200 or $300 a month in food stamps, very often they can make themselves welcome into another household by bringing those food stamps to that household. And it is interesting, you think about the flexibility, there's an inflexibility of our systems. They don't recognize that, and very often people can be sanctioned, right, for buying food that's not just for them. On the other hand, if you can provide somebody avoiding homelessness for $200 or $300 a month, that's a pretty efficient social service program. Another thing I think is important is to sort of looking at, we didn't talk a lot about this, but the way that people negotiate social services and these silos that we have. We have a medical care system, we have a child welfare system, we have emergency service systems, and they're very often separate and they're not coherent. I'll tell you one quick story because I know we're pressed on time here, but I talked with this one woman who was describing her frustration when she became homeless and had a child. And I said, well, what happened? And she said, well, I went to the state human service office and I said, and I need housing assistance. And they said, that's okay. We just need to open up a child welfare case and then we can provide some assistance. And she said, well, I'm going to lose my kid to foster care? And they said, not necessarily, and if it does, it's only going to be temporary. So she walked out of the office and said, I don't need help, just leave me alone. Then she decided, okay, I'm going to do something else. I'm going to go ask for assistance, but before I do, I'm going to ask my mother to watch my child. So I do that, and I show up at the welfare office, and I say, I'm homeless, I have a child, I need welfare, and I need... They said, well, we can help you with housing, but I'm not caring for your child right now. I said, okay, that's not what I want. So she left and came back the third time and said, here's the deal, my mom is watching the kid. She said she would watch them for 2 weeks, so my kid is safe, and I need help with welfare, and I need housing assistance. And she got both of those things, right? And the point is, you have this situation. It's a family who's experienced homelessness and poverty and unemployment. They need to be helped, right? They don't need to be thrown these very, very complex sets of rules. For service providers, it's understanding the survival orientation of many who are in deep poverty, understanding their apprehension around social services, understanding the tremendous stress that they deal with just to get food and shelter on a day-to-day basis, sort of being sensitive to that. To make services convenient and accessible. To understand that if you ask somebody to come to a case management meeting and you're on the other side of town, that half-hour journey for that person and their children. And to sort of be sensitive around
We did
those
have individuals who were forced to bring their children with them to court appointments and were subsequently jailed for that and were held in contempt of court for having their child with them and bringing them into that circumstance, which creates a whole other level of difficulty for that individual who was already challenged to begin with.
And then finally, to design services to help people as opposed to change the poor. Our programs, our systems are still based on the idea that the poor are poor because there's something wrong with them. And we provide food stamps that have case management requirements. Sometimes they have work requirements. And our welfare system that's time limited and has extreme work requirements. And that perhaps they just need to provide assistance and understand that these families understand what their children need. And that they're very much in terms of their goals, their aspirations, and values. Resources, transportation, educational enhancements, to schedule service appointments in such a way that are conducive to the ways that they're currently coping, and that these can go along better serving the homeless.
And we hope that our research provides some of the insight into the challenges that families are facing with this qualitative research, hearing from the mouths of individuals who are experiencing this, to give some context to service providers and how best to help them, because we have to help in some way. But it's difficult to help if you don't know what the most pressing needs are. And it's difficult to help if you don't know the specific challenges related to having a child and maintaining consistency for that child. So we see ourselves in many ways as a middle man, middle woman, a voice for those who don't have a voice to relay their stories and their concerns to social service agencies, to give them back some power and agency in their own life that they inherently lack given the powerlessness they oftentimes experience from being homeless. And so this type of research can provide a really important perspective and really give them a sense of what it is to live that day-to-day life, that day-to-day struggle with children and trying to navigate all the various needs that their children have and that they themselves may have, in part because of being homeless, especially mental health challenges and substance abuse challenges.
I think that's it. I think I covered most of those other points there.
Yeah.
But for the sake of time, are there questions? Thank you.
Very good. So we'll come around. Oh, sorry, you're going to go that way. I thought you were going this way. All right, go that way.
Who knew questions were a contact sport?
Hey, Jill. Jill. My phone is connected to a cord.
Hi. I
Say it again?
talk extremely interesting. I'm just when you're talking about Washington State, you're talking about Michigan with a governor like Snyder. Do you find in these two different states, Washington known for its humanity, I think, and as opposed to Michigan, that seems to be the problem when they get the help, but when we have reactive government, they're thought of as less than citizens. And I wonder if you found that the case.
Yeah, I think it's a little hard to say. Instances too were the communities. When we were doing research in Michigan, it was a very small rural town, and Spokane is at least a medium-sized city. Not quite as big as Providence, but not that much smaller than a city like Providence. So part of it was the urban difference. I think also too, it's hard to say it's a state government difference because federal, and the limitations and the difficulties are federal. One of the things I did see though in the child welfare system was that Washington seemed to be a little bit more progressive than Michigan, at least in the time. For example, Washington came up with a law that explicitly said you cannot remove a child for the issue of poverty alone. Meaning because it's forcing the state to say we're going to do something unless we see it as a behavioral issue or a drug offense or something like that. So to some extent, I would say that's true. But in another way, they're kind of operating both within the same federal constraints of the welfare system and HUD funding, which supports housing services.
Yeah, the same limitations on dollars exist in both circumstances, and I think there's a desire to put some of these funds toward prevention, but ultimately they're sort of handicapped. And it's been very eye-opening in Spokane in particular, getting a chance to talk to the various agencies and understand the limitations they have placed upon them to utilize these dollars in a particular way. So while we often have the incentive and the desire to try to prevent some of these circumstances, the dollars are just not there, or they're sort of handicapped in terms of how they can use it. And the need is so great among those who are immediately homeless that oftentimes the funds just have to go to those who are currently experiencing it versus those who are on the brink.
Yeah. Other questions?
Would you comment on your feelings about how social services are provided, the difference the way social services are provided to the people in need by private organizations and church organizations and public government organizations.
I think it's a good question. It's hard to comment too much on that with respect to housing services, because almost entirely it's public money, but it's operated by private and faith-based nonprofits or charitable organizations. One thing I would say, though, is that where you have public delivery of social services, you have more money. And you have more of an ability to provide for the family or the individual what that individual needs. And I don't think that's because the privates are not good. It's just their budgets are extremely limited. One of the other things we've seen in child welfare is one of the challenges, I think, of the private delivery of child welfare services is that sometimes private agencies are competing with one another for clients. So we expect, private is going to lead to innovation, which I think it can, but it can also lead to competition, which can create some difficulty when you have private agencies who are actually fighting for clients. At other times, in the past, I've done some research on substance abuse substance abuse service organizations, and some of them would do things like, let's lobby the judges to try to extend the time that somebody has to spend in service. And they do that not because of the services, but because their budget needs it. And so you think, well, nonprofits, if you take an organizations class, we talk about the goal of any organization is primarily to survive. Right? And if to survive, what do? They have to
have people using their services.
Be strategic and those sorts of things, which aren't always conducive. On the other hand, when you're leaner and smaller, you can be more flexible, and I think that can work well when that public money is combined with private money that allows these organizations to have more flexibility.
I'm surprised that there weren't more people with major mental illness that you contended with. Perhaps I'm wrong, but I got the impression that many urban homeless people had schizophrenia and major mental illness.
Yeah, and I think you're probably right. And that was in Michigan. It was rural, right? And there weren't too many single chronically homeless adults that we interviewed. A lot of them were families and people that were homeless for shorter amounts of time. Although some did have mental illness that wasn't.
We did come across a lot of individuals who hadn't been clinically diagnosed with depression or anxiety or PTSD, but were definitely showing symptoms therein and were living it, if not for that diagnosis. They were very much living, we could see it in their faces, we could see it in the way they talked, and it's not necessarily surprising, but for the vast anxiety, especially parents, and for some pretty deep depression around their circumstances. Yeah.
I think when in Spokane, which is, we certainly have chronic homelessness and amongst people with mental illness, but in Spokane, we primarily interviewed families and not individuals. So you're right, and I think it's probably true in urban areas. You're probably looking at 30 to 40% of the chronically homeless with pretty severe mental health issues.
We have time for a couple more questions.
Thank you. Along the idea of policy change, how could the Fight for 15, addressing stagnant wages, implementing a universal health care program, and addressing Bill Clinton's welfare reform of the 1990s, how could that affect modern-day homeless? And my second part, that has to do with you just talked about the stress of being homeless. How does this, there have been a lot of studies on the stress of being poor. How does the stress of being homeless affect being homeless, and when are the mental illnesses occurring during homelessness, before or after?
I'll tackle the second part of that question and leave him, he's the policy guy, so I'll leave that to him. I think, I was just going to add to the last question there at the end, this idea that it's difficult to surmise when the mental illness challenges begin. Are they of part of the homeless experience, or do they perhaps lead to homelessness in some circumstances? And it's difficult in to some extent to be able to tease that out. Obviously, the experience of homelessness is traumatic. It is rife with issues around anxiety and depression, but for a lot of these individuals and the manner in which they spoke about themselves and their histories leading up to their first homeless incident, they oftentimes had warning signs in place, be it poor family relationships, feeling as if they were isolated within their family. A good number of them described themselves as being the black sheep of the family, never feeling as if they had a home within their family to some extent. And so you kind of see the warning signs ahead of time in terms of what might lead someone to use alcohol, to use drugs, to cope, to self-medicate. And for those who do end up becoming homeless, a good many of them turn to alcohol and drugs to help medicate themselves because they don't have access to the medications that would actually help alleviate some of their stress and depression. So it's, and that's without getting into the impact on children themselves, which is especially traumatic. And we had an opportunity to talk with students today, and we mentioned the idea that, that intergenerational transmission of poverty and the struggle therein begins very early on in life, and we see pathological changes in children when they experience that kind of trauma very early in life. And it's all the more reason to get in and try to prevent this from happening so that cycle is not repeated.
I think it's really interesting, recent research in brain development, just looking at the very poor and the homeless. I mean, measurable differences in the gray matter in the brain, and
25% smaller and less development in certain areas of the brain among children who have extreme poverty.
I was actually talking to a student today who studied kinesiology. I don't know if she's here, but the impacts of chronic stress associated with homelessness, and that creates cortisol, which can be associated with delayed brain growth, right? And you think about the stress. I mean, I think the stress that's kind of doesn't seem like dramatic, but it's listening to these folks describe waking up, having to clean their clothes, and then they have to go borrow laundry detergent, and then they have to walk to the laundromat, and then they have to figure out where can I get food that doesn't require a refrigerator, and can I borrow somebody's microwave? And doing all this stuff just for the basic necessities is tremendously stressful. And when you're doing that with children in tow, that stress is obviously going to be conveyed to those kids as well. So I think it's kind of interesting to me, that this physical research is coming out at the same time we're beginning to piece together how is it that this comes to make life so hard? How is it that poverty comes to impact somebody's ability to learn?
Yeah, and some of what we saw in the kids who are in the school environment was that bullying around being poor, showing signs of stress and strain and acting out, and oftentimes that's misinterpreted by administrators and by teachers as having attention deficit disorder or having some kind of learning disability, being autistic, when really what's at the root of some of this problem experiencing extreme struggle within the family home and not having another outlet for that. Interestingly, the news came out about a school that provided laundry services within the school, and they saw an uptick in attendance among students who were extremely poor and homeless because they had the opportunity to present themselves in a way that made them feel more comfortable and more normative with their peers. So these seemingly small changes that we can make to a school environment so that children do not stand out, so that they're not identified in ways that would make their educational experience more deleterious, I think are oftentimes end up having really big impacts.
The question you asked about the minimum wage and the $15 an hour, I don't know. My guess is it would do more for homelessness prevention than it would to help people escape homelessness. And I say that because, well, many of our people that we've talked to were working, and many homeless work. I think it's not common that they work full-time steady hours. And for many of them, I think that is the first steady job with steady hours would probably be needed. Not to say that making more money wouldn't also help. So the other difficulty is, talking to economists, what's going to happen, I think it's going to depend on the locality if a raised minimum wage is going to lead to more or less employment. And I'll leave that for the economists. I don't know.
Don't everybody look at me. So I think that was our two questions in one, two great questions. So thank you again to Professors Hilton and Trella for coming.
Thanks.
Just a reminder that next week we have in here to talk about gender and inequality and her book Under the Bus, and that is a joint program with the Gender and Women's Studies and is their annual Carlson Lecture. So we look forward to seeing you all again next week.